Covered several of these hearings now, and what I would say was different about yesterday is you saw Democrats and Republicans more united, and they also understood what they were talking about. They asked pretty smart, pretty tough questions. What was your takeaway?
I think there are some big questions before Congress, like what's the future of some of our most important technology laws? And the one I'm thinking of in particular is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was one of the foundational laws for the internet. I do think the representative right, they were unified in their upsetness, but for different reasons. The Republicans blasted the platforms for removing allegedly too much conservative speech. The Democrats blasted them for not removing enough speech, particularly hate speech and disinformation. So it kind of laid bare the partisan differences about political speech. But I think Congress actually has theatrical hearings like this when there's less consensus about legislating. So I do think these things are inversely proportional to each other. More hearings sometimes means less legislating.
So you were the 7th employee at Google's Washington office. You worked there for more than a decade. Who do you think is to blame?
I don't think there's anyone to blame. I think the fact is, like, you take the question of online speech, and these are global platforms. They start off from a perspective, I think, of wanting to allow as much speech as possible, but they also want to promote trust. They don't want to be a haven for QAnon, conspiracy theories of lies related to the elections or vaccines. And so they're asserting their own First Amendment right to remove that kind of speech. And obviously that's going to be controversial because not everybody agrees with that. But the thing that I love about the open internet is that if you want to see conspiracy theories, you can go to Gab, Parler, 4chan, the open internet, and that makes all those things possible. But that doesn't mean that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have an obligation to host that kind of thing. And I think that's a really important principle that was overlooked. Facebook, Google, Twitter, they have just as much First Amendment rights as the New York Times and Breitbart.
Well, and if you look at Facebook, Google, and Twitter, you don't have to look very far to find the conspiracy theories that you're talking about. I mean, you have to admit they're not doing a good enough job of policing this stuff. If they don't want it on there, then why don't they work harder to change that?
Yeah. Well, I think what you see is, look, members of Congress have constructive feedback about what they want the platforms to do more of in terms of removing incendiary speech. And some of that feedback can be helpful. The thing that I worry about is when they take that and say, well, let's revoke Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which they think is a way to constrain the power of big tech. But the reality is actually, if revoking would probably hurt the smaller platforms. Section 230 is kind of like if I rent a car from Hertz and I run a red light, get caught on a red light camera, guess who pays that ticket? It's not Hertz, it's me. And that makes sense because it promotes my individual responsibility, taking responsibility for my speech. So same thing, if I go into Reddit and I say, John Doe is a crook, John Doe can sue me for defamation, but he can't sue Reddit because Reddit's not expected to review all that. I think that's a really important principle. Revoking Section 230, look, Google, Facebook, Twitter, these companies have armies of lawyers and content specialists. They'd be fine if 230 went away. The company that gets hurt is the next Facebook, the next Google, and all those small platforms that depend on the same liability protections.
So do you think Section 230 should be changed at all? Mark Zuckerberg is arguing for some changes. It sounded like Sundar Pichai is cautioning against any change at all for the reasons that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's widely misunderstood. And again, I keep analogizing to this rental car example. We want people to take individual responsibility for their speech online. That's what helps create a healthier internet. And Section 230 is actually a routing mechanism. It says that if I defame you, you come after me, not the platform. And that makes sense. There is accountability. But if we didn't have that principle, we would really threaten a whole host of smaller sites, user-generated content sites, ordinary websites that aren't in a position to review every piece of comment or content before it's posted. So this is a really important principle that also promotes a diversity of thought and dialogue online. I think it's just widely misunderstood. I think it's a great law, and I think policymakers who care about healthy online communities should absolutely support Section 230.
Interesting. Now, having worked at Google as long as you did, do you put Google in the same boat as Facebook and Twitter? Obviously, they all have their own problems, and we saw Mark Zuckerberg get the lion's share of the questioning yesterday. But should Sundar Pichai be in the room with Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey at all?
Look, I love all these companies. I use all their services. I'm a fan of all this. And I think one of the things is, like, companies they screw up sometimes, right? They have blind spots. Sometimes their products get abused, and that's okay. But I genuinely believe the people who are working at the companies want to do the best thing for society. They want to do the right thing. Sometimes, again, this feedback that they get from policymakers about their speech policies can actually be helpful. It can illuminate some of their blind spots sometimes. But that doesn't mean we should then try to do something that honestly violates the First Amendment, where would have Congress saying, no website, you can't moderate content, you can't allow this kind of content, or you should allow that. That's a pretty direct violation of the First Amendment. That's not good for Facebook, for Twitter, or for any website for that matter.
Do you think wanting to do the right thing, though, is enough? I mean, it's been 2 decades, over 2 decades for Google, going on 2 decades for Facebook. Congresswoman Kelly there also told us she thinks that Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey aren't the right people to be deciding how hate gets moderated on their platforms. They're white men. They don't understand how some of this stuff disproportionately impacts minority groups.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that feedback like that is really helpful because, again, they do have blind spots. And so I think that's great feedback for them to hear. I do think the thing that people sometimes miss is that I don't think these CEOs really want to be making all these tough speech decisions. It's just a consequence of our age. But I think what they do want is they want to make sure that their services are as popular as possible or as positive experience as possible. And every decision they make on one of these speech decisions helps shape and reflect what kind of service they want to be for their users. That's okay for them to make that decision, just like Gab and Parler can say, look, we're going to allow anything, and that's the kind of service we want to be for our users. So they're just trying different approaches to this really thorny question of content moderation, allow more, allow less, et cetera.